Hello, John Perry here. Today we are going to have our final video on random mutations. Are mutations really random? Again, this question comes from Aki. He wanted to know about this new Nature paper about random mutations. What this paper claims is that mutations are not always as random as we thought that they were. Today we're going to dive deep into this paper itself and the history of evolutionary thought to see exactly how much this new discovery clashes with what we thought we knew about evolution. This paper has made a huge splash in the news. Here's an article about the paper saying, DNA mutations are not random. New research radically changes our understanding of evolution. New study provides first evidence of non-random mutations in DNA. Study challenges evolutionary theory that DNA mutations are random. Now, let's suppose for a moment that those aren't just clickbaity headlines and that they actually accurately represent what was published in this paper. If mutations are not fully random, does that mean that they happen, quote, on purpose? And if they do happen on purpose, what exactly does that even mean? If you go around on the internet and read what creationists are writing about this article, this seems to be what they think is happening. Scientists have confirmed that Jesus reaches down and causes individual mutations to happen. Other folks who are wise enough to realize that every time you see something that doesn't make total sense to you, that doesn't automatically mean that it's a miracle. They have a different sort of picture in their head. Their picture looks something like this. People who haven't read the actual paper, but they just read the headlines, a lot of them are thinking, well, maybe cells have some sort of a way to reach inside themselves and cause specific mutations when needed. And if that's true, and if that's the norm, if that's how mutations normally happen, that really is in pretty big violation of what we thought we understood about evolution. Darwin presented evidence that heritable variation plus cumulative selection gives rise to adaptive evolution. So he gave us evidence that things like the eye and so on, they were evolving through descent with modification, acted upon by natural selection. Cumulative selection. Organisms, when they have offspring, those offspring have slight variations to the left or to the right. Some of those variations will happen to be beneficial for that organism, meaning that that organism is more likely to reproduce than others. That's how natural selection works. These small, rare, beneficial variations, most of the variations that occur, accidentally, are not going to be beneficial, but some of them will. Those are saved up over multiple generations, while the negative variations are discarded over generations. That's the process of natural selection, cumulative evolution by natural selection. He did not believe that these variations or these mutations were purposeful. Natural selection can do nothing until favorable variations chance to occur. That's the word that he liked to use. He actually never used the phrase random mutation. He talked about chance variations. If we fast forward to the 1950s, we hear this from Dobzhansky. He's one of the major founders of what's called the modern synthesis, the merger between Darwinian evolution and Mendelian genetics. This is what he said about mutation. An ideal situation would be if the organism were to respond to the challenge of the changing environment by producing only beneficial mutations where and when needed. But nature has not been kind enough to endow creations with such a providential ability. G.G. Simpson, one of his comrades, another person who's considered to be a founding father of the modern synthesis. He was responding to people's questions about what random means in evolution. What he does is he describes that when we say random, we don't mean mathematically random in its purest sense. What we mean is that the mutation isn't the exact mutation that the organism needs in that moment. And the example he gives is this: heat-induced mutations do not produce phenotypic change related to heat tolerance. So if you take bacteria or something and put them in an environment that's too hot for them, that will induce mutations. They will start having more mutations more frequently. And so you might think, oh, well, it's trying to mutate. No, what's happening is that it's not able to maintain its genome because the heat is causing stress on its DNA. Things are breaking and it's having trouble fixing them. The mutations that occur are random and that they're not specific mutations to help that bacteria deal with heat. They're just changes. It might happen that one of them does help the bacteria deal with heat, in which case that is called mutational rescue. But the bacteria doesn't somehow know what type of mutation it needs to deal better with the heat. It's just experiencing mutations. There is a small chance that one of those mutations will help the bacteria deal with heat, but it's a pretty small chance. Not zero, but it is a pretty small chance. Everyone's comfortable saying that humans do things on purpose, right? A lot of people, I think, are also comfortable saying that animals do things on purpose. A couple of years back, I was driving my car. This is in Corvallis, Oregon, and there was a crow, probably, 40, 60 feet up in the air, and he threw a walnut at my car. And I was talking to some people about it that lived nearby, and they said that, yeah, that bird is always doing that. He's always picking walnuts from this tree, and he throws them at cars because they'll run over them and open them, and then he eats them. So I'm perfectly happy saying that that crow is doing this on purpose. He's got this thinking mind. A lot of people get a little bit weird when you try to say that cells do things on purpose. And I suppose I'm a little bit less comfortable with that as well. I would say that maybe you could say that cells do things, quote, on purpose, but little quotes around it, because cells don't have thinking minds, so far as we know, right? But cells do have evolved enzymes that evolved under selection pressure to perform specific functions. And so you could say that cells do things on purpose, in quotes, right? Darwin didn't think that mutations were caused on purpose for the most part. And early thinkers in the 1950s and 60s also didn't think that mutations happened on purpose, or at least that was not the norm. But there are some specific examples of systems where you could say that the cell is causing specific mutations on purpose. The most famous example is the CRISPR immunity system. This is a system that bacteria use to fight viruses. There is an enzyme that has evolved to search for sequences that do not exist in its own genome. And it does this physically. So, a stretch of DNA is a physical thing. And the sequences, the nucleotides in a stretch of DNA, they are physical things. And different nucleotides have different physical properties. And different sets of nucleotides have different physical properties. And there is this enzyme that has evolved that sticks like a magnet to a specific sequence of DNA that is not found in bacteria, but is often found in viruses. It will stick to that, just like a magnet, and then it will cut out a big chunk of DNA from that virus. That kills the virus. So the virus tries to attack the cell, it inserts its DNA into the cell. This enzyme recognizes that DNA and cuts a big chunk out of it, disabling the virus. But then what happens is that chunk of DNA gets inserted into the bacteria's genome. This system causes a specific mutation in the bacteria. It's exposed to the virus. In response, it causes a specific mutation, inserting that virus's DNA into its own DNA. And then it uses that new inserted piece of DNA as a reference to find virus DNA quicker in the future. So if this same species of virus attacks it again, it will find it even faster than it did the first time. It's a type of adaptive immunity. CRISPR, you could legitimately say, is something that Darwin and friends did not expect to be discovered. It's actively causing specific mutations in response to an environmental challenge, viruses in this case. Not a whole lot is known about the step-by-step evolution of this system, but systems like this can evolve when there is a very consistent problem in an organism's environment. Really complex adaptations can evolve to deal with that problem if that problem is consistent, if it's around long enough. And viruses and bacteria have been battling since forever. So it does make sense that something like this could exist. But to think that a system like this would exist to help a bacteria solve any problem that it deals with, oh, it's too warm now. Oh, well, I'm going to somehow sense that it's too warm and then figure out how to mutate my DNA to make it so that I'm no longer too hot. That's weird. It's weird to think that that's how evolution works. But back in the 80s, there were a bunch of scientists claiming that this does happen. They called it directed mutation. And there was this big controversy, a bunch of papers back and forth, a bunch of studies and counter studies where people are arguing about this and trying to figure out what's really going on. This article right here summarizes the whole thing and kind of concludes that debate. In the end, it was found that actually Darwin was right. There are very, very few exceptions like CRISPR. The vast majority of mutations are happening spontaneously, what Darwin called by chance. That said, it is worth pointing out that there still are people trying to look for directed mutation systems. What did this recent paper, Mutation Bias Reflects Natural Selection in Arabidopsis thaliana, what did they actually find? Did they find directed mutations happening? No. No. What they found is that the location of mutations within the genome is not completely random. We talked about that last week. This is well known for a long time, actually. There are mutational hotspots and mutational cold spots. Some parts of the cell are safer than other parts of the cell for DNA to live in. But what they found in their paper is that cells have taken advantage of this. Protein coding genes, so inside the bodies of protein coding genes, mutation frequency is reduced by half, and it's reduced by 2/3 inside essential genes. So essential genes, we talked about those 2 weeks ago. Those are genes that if you have a mutation that's severe enough to break an essential gene, the cell that suffered that mutation will die. Essential genes are protected from mutation far more than the rest of the genome is. In other words, there are kings and pawns within the genome. Not all genes are treated equally. Does this contradict the theory of evolution as understood by Darwin and others? Not in any fundamental way, no. Darwin didn't think that variations or mutations on purpose were expected. But that's not what this paper found. They didn't find that mutations are happening on purpose. They found that certain sections of the genome are more protected against mutation than other sections. Again, that doesn't contradict what people were saying in the 1950s either. So no, it does not contradict in a fundamental way how we understood evolution. However, for a very long time, the basic assumption that we made whenever we saw a stretch of DNA in two distantly related organisms that was identical or nearly identical, what we assumed is that natural selection was actively maintaining those sequences. So every time there was a mutation, the organism that suffered that mutation would die, or eventually their descendants would be outcompeted by the descendants of their neighbors. We believe that natural selection was actively maintaining those sequences. And now we know that that's not necessarily the case. Those sequences might just have a much lower mutation rate, and that is why they don't change very much, even over evolutionary time. So the findings of this paper don't fundamentally challenge the theory of evolution, but they do challenge a long-held assumption within the theory of evolution. This here is my favorite image from the paper, my favorite diagram. I liked it so much that I actually redesigned it in my style. They give us a loaded dice analogy. Evolution at its core really is still a game of chance, but the way that evolutionary dynamics have played out over the years has skewed the odds in the organism's favor. This allows fewer miscarriages by making the nastiest types of mutations very, very rare. Does this new study provide the first evidence in the sense that we're talking about here, in that different parts of the genome mutate at different rates, and that natural selection is taking advantage of that fact and actually putting important genes in safe spots? No, this is definitely not the first paper that figured this out. Back when I first started teaching evolution, I made the mistake that a lot of people make in assuming that mutations are completely random within the genome. And I had made a video, I can't remember which video it was, but in that video, I specifically said in the script, mutations are completely random and happen anywhere within the genome. And when I was showing it to one of my old college professors, he was like, whoa, no, you got to check out this paper right here. The paper published in 2004, Functional Bias and Spatial Organization of Genes in Mutational Hot and Cold Regions in the Human Genome. Now, first off, we have known for a very long time that there are mutational hotspots and mutational cold spots in organisms' genomes. We've known that since like the 1960s, but it's been debated whether or not natural selection ever exploits that fact. And right here in 2004, this paper says that yes, natural selection does exploit this, and they gave evidence, pretty good evidence, suggesting that in humans, our most important genes happen to be located in the safest spots of our genomes. And last week I talked about a mechanism that could cause that. So if we already knew this, then what does this new paper really even tell us? Well, first off, they did huge real-time experiments on mutation rates. That paper from 2004, that convinced me that I needed to edit my video. My biology professor was convinced of that as well. But not everyone in the scientific community was. This new paper, what they did is they performed a huge real-time experiment on mutation rates. They looked at how mutations happen in real time to make sure that important genes really were mutating less than the rest of the genome. Second, they proposed a mechanism. They gave pretty good evidence showing how it is that they think cells are actually doing this physically. And then finally, they demonstrated mathematically that normal natural selection can easily cause what they found. So what was their proposed mechanism? Last week, I talked about translocation mutations and transposition mutations. We've long suspected that these types of mutations, these are types of mutations that take chunks of DNA and move them to new spots in the genome. If these are happening just by accident all over the place, if one of these translocation mutations happens to move a really important gene into a safer spot of the genome, the mother who has that mutation, when she has offspring, she's less likely to have miscarriages. And therefore, natural selection can promote that mutation, that translocation mutation. That's very likely one of the important mechanisms that allows genomes to evolve in this way. But the new mechanism that was proposed, it's not totally new, it's actually 10 years old, but they found a lot of supporting evidence for this. DNA is not just loosely hanging out inside of a cell. It's wrapped around protein complexes called histones. And when a gene gets used by the cell, a bunch of different proteins clamp onto it, and they make a copy of it into RNA, and then that RNA is used for something. Maybe it becomes a functional part of a ribosome, or maybe it's used to code for protein. But when a gene is being used, histones are chemically modified, and they're chemically modified in a reversible way. Little molecules get stuck to them, and we call these epigenetic markers. And because these epigenetic markers get stuck to genes that are being used a lot, researchers who worked on this new paper 10 years ago, they suggested that maybe some of our DNA repair proteins, the proteins that scan DNA for little nicks and breaks and fix them, maybe some of those have evolved the ability to recognize these little markers. Maybe they stick to them. And if so, that would mean that genes that are used more often get more protection from the cell. They have more access to these repair mechanisms. They suggested that 10 years ago, and then they found evidence for it here in this paper. Pretty strong evidence. That's really, really cool. And then finally, they demonstrated mathematically that normal natural selection can easily cause what they found. And that demonstration was actually 10 years ago in the 2012 paper. This is the paper, Non-Random Mutation, the Evolution of Targeted Hypermutation and Hypomutation. And that was a really important paper because there were debates from people who work strictly in theory in these mathematical models of evolution, suggesting that even though there are variable mutation rates in the genomes of organisms, there probably isn't enough selection pressure to allow natural selection to take advantage of this fact. This paper 10 years ago was a rebuttal to that. They said, actually, this could happen, especially if you had a mechanism that allowed genes that are used a lot to have more access to the cell's repair systems. You could easily get the evolution of hypomutation, so slowed down mutation in essential genes. So that is what this paper has found. It's a really cool paper. Most of what's here is not new, especially it's not completely new, but they really did demonstrate once and for all. I mean, it's very, very hard to argue with the data that they've presented. Yes, not only does natural selection weed out mutations when they do happen in essential genes, but mutations actually happen less often. And this protection evolved. It evolved through the normal process of descent with modification, acted upon by natural selection. They have this gem of a line here right before the conclusion. They say, while perhaps initially surprising, our synthesis between epigenomics, so those little tags that I was telling you about, and population genetic theory predicts that the observed bias could readily arise via natural selection. Before closing, I want to point out something that they talked about really briefly. They barely touched on it in this paper. I think they're probably going to publish a paper that goes way more in depth later. But I want to point something out about this system that they found, this mechanism that they found. These epigenetic markers, these changes in the histones that happen when a gene is used a lot, those are temporary. In genes that are constantly being used, those are constantly being put back on them. Those tags are. But in genes that are not used very often, those will eventually dissipate. What this means is that if, for multiple generations, a specific gene is not being used, the cell will stop protecting that gene from mutation. Basically, what these people have discovered is a real-time sensor which tattletales on genes for slacking off. Freeloaders get mutated. That is really cool. That is really cool. I hope that they continue investigating down this line. I'm curious to see how the dynamics of this system play out in real life. With what I just told you there, I don't know how that would translate back into the germline very well. In fact, I don't know that it would at all. Maybe it wouldn't at all. Maybe this would only be beneficial in single-celled organisms. But super interesting to think about. So, there you have it, folks. Are mutations random? Yes, they are random in the sense that, with very, very few exceptions, mutations do not happen, quote, on purpose. As G.G. Simpson said, heat-induced mutations do not produce phenotypic change related to heat tolerance. They just produce change. As Dobzhansky said, an ideal situation would be if the organism were to respond to the challenge of the changing environment by producing only beneficial mutations where and when needed, but nature has not been kind enough to endow creations with such a providential ability. So far as we know, those claims are still true. There are a few exceptions like CRISPR that violate those claims, but they are very, very few. Mutations are random and that they do not happen, quote, on purpose. However, they are not completely random and that they don't happen perfectly randomly in any location in the genome, and natural selection has taken advantage of this. There are kings and there are pawns in the genome. Aki, I hope that answers your question. So long for now.